You hear the buzzing first. A deep, mechanical roar that doesn't just echo, it vibrates. And before your brain can even process what's coming, the trees in front of you explode in a shower of bark, smoke, and unrelenting firepower. That's not thunder. That's the sound of an M45 quad mount, better known as the Quad 50, lighting up the jungle like it's trying to erase the entire.
If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Your feedback helps shape what we cover next, and you being here keeps the conversation going. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.
Canopy from existence. Now, imagine you're a Japanese sniper in the Philippines in 1945, hiding 50 feet up in a tree, camouflaged to the point of invisibility. You've trained for years in this kind of warfare: jungle stealth, guerrilla ambushes, elevation advantage. You're supposed to have the upper hand. You do, until the Americans roll up with a weapon designed to shoot down aircraft and aim it straight at the trees. Suddenly, your perch doesn't feel so clever anymore. Let's back it up. The M45 quad mount wasn't originally built for ground combat. This beast was made to shoot planes out of the sky, low-flying enemy fighters, bombers, anything that dared swoop in too close. With 4 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns mounted on a rotating turret, this thing could spit out over 2,200 rounds per minute. That's not a burst. That's a storm. But here's where things get interesting. War never sticks to the script. In the dense jungles of the Pacific Theater, particularly during the American push through the Philippines, traditional tactics started to fall apart. Japanese forces had mastered the terrain, taking up positions in trees, caves, and thick foliage. They weren't charging en masse or waiting in trenches. They were waiting in silence, often above eye level, blending into the jungle, and striking with deadly precision. American infantry found themselves pinned down again and again by unseen enemies: snipers, spotters, machine gunners, all hidden in elevated positions that were impossible to spot until they fired. And by then, it was usually too late. So what did the Americans do? They got creative. Troops on the ground started looking at their arsenal a little differently. That shiny Quad 50 mounted on the back of a half-track, maybe it wasn't just for planes. Maybe, just maybe, it could solve their jungle problem. Because if you can shoot through the air and hit a fast-moving aircraft, why not point that same firepower horizontally through the jungle? And just like that, tactical innovation was born. Picture this: a team from the 211th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion pulls up behind a pinned infantry unit. They crank the turret up just a little, not sky high, not ground level, right at the middle of the tree line. And then, they open fire. What happens next is something you can't really prepare for. The canopy doesn't just shake, it disintegrates. Branches snap, leaves ignite, tree trunks start falling like dominoes. Entire sniper nests are obliterated in seconds. It's not just a firefight anymore. It's a mechanical apocalypse, ripping through the jungle with such intensity that entire positions vanish before they can react. Japanese soldiers, who had once held the upper hand secure in their hidden positions, start fleeing. Some jump from trees, preferring to face capture than get mulched in their perch. Others are buried under the very foliage they used for cover. And the Americans, for the first time in weeks, they can actually move. That's the kind of battlefield shift we're talking about. One tactical adjustment, one moment of thinking outside the manual, and suddenly, the rules of jungle warfare change completely. What's wild is that none of this came from high command. This wasn't part of some grand strategy laid out in Washington. It came from the guys on the ground. The ones sweating through their uniforms, dodging sniper fire, trying to make it through another day. They saw a problem. They saw a weapon. And they made a connection no one else had thought to make. That's how innovation works in war, not in boardrooms, but in foxholes. Of course, there were challenges. The M45 quad mount, mounted on the back of an M16 half-track, wasn't exactly built for narrow jungle paths. The thing was loud, heavy, and chewed through ammo like a kid with Halloween candy. But it didn't matter. The results were so effective, so immediately impactful, that troops made it work. Supply chains scrambled to keep the .50 caliber rounds coming. Infantry units coordinated with anti-aircraft battalions. The jungle, once a place of deadly silence, became a proving ground for what firepower and flexibility could really do when paired with soldier ingenuity. And it wasn't just about raw destruction. The psychological impact was just as important. The Quad 50 had a sound, a distinct, guttural rhythm of devastation that echoed through the trees. It became a calling card, a warning. American troops would talk about it with reverence, how the moment the half-tracks rolled up, morale surged. You could be outnumbered, outgunned, Surrounded still breathed easier when you heard the clack of those 4 barrels lighting up. On the flip side, Japanese forces feared it. The Quad 50 wasn't like traditional small arms fire, which you could dodge, hide from, or wait out. This was relentless, unstoppable, and worse, accurate. Once American gunners figured out how to walk their fire through the trees, there was no such thing as a safe position anymore. And you know what's funny? For all its brute force, the Quad 50 wasn't some flashy, high-tech prototype. It was just smartly applied hardware. That's the real lesson here. The success wasn't in the technology, it was in the application. In the soldiers who said, "Why not try this?" That attitude of lateral thinking under pressure carried the Quad 50 through not just World War II, but into Korea, and later Vietnam. Across 3 major conflicts, it earned a reputation not just as an anti-aircraft system, but as one of the most versatile support weapons in the American arsenal. By the time Vietnam rolled around, the weapon had been adapted again, this time for convoy defense. Mounted on gun trucks, the Quad 50 would unleash hell on ambushers along supply routes. Same principle, overwhelming firepower, used creatively to solve tactical problems, and always with that signature hum that could make enemies scatter before the first bullet even hit. So why does this story still matter today? Because it's a blueprint. A reminder that the most effective tools in warfare aren't always shiny and new. Sometimes, they're old, repurposed, and wielded by soldiers who aren't afraid to question the rulebook. In a world obsessed with high-tech solutions, drones, precision-guided everything, it's easy to forget that raw effectiveness often comes down to who's holding the trigger and how they choose to use it. The Quad 50 didn't win battles by itself. It won them because soldiers saw what it could be, not just what it was built for. That mindset, that is the real weapon. So yeah, the Quad 50 cut down entire trees to reach hidden snipers. But more than that, it cut through the fog of convention. It proved that sometimes, the key to victory isn't a new invention, it's a new perspective. And in the thick, green hell of the Philippine jungle, that perspective turned a defensive anti-aircraft mount into a terror of the treetops. A weapon so feared, so effective, that it changed how enemies fought and how soldiers believed they could win. Not bad for a repurposed anti-aircraft gun on a half-track, huh? If that blew your mind even a little, drop a comment. What other legendary battlefield hacks should we cover next? And don't forget to subscribe, because this is just one of many stories where innovation meets intensity, and where the battlefield teaches lessons no classroom ever could. Imagine you're a soldier on patrol. The humidity is punishing, thick enough to choke on. Every leaf looks like a hiding spot. Every tree branch could be holding eyes. You've heard stories, guys getting picked off by a single shot from above. No warning, just crack gone. You're not just walking through a forest. You're walking through someone else's trap. And then, like a mechanical thunderstorm on wheels, you hear it. The half-track rolls into position, and suddenly, the jungle isn't so quiet anymore. Those 4 empty barrels spin toward the trees like they've got a score to settle. A second later, the sky opens up. The noise is indescribable. It's not gunfire in the way you think of it. It's like a buzzsaw married a freight train and had a metal baby. Each .50 cal round hits with such force that it doesn't just pierce wood, it erases it. The canopy disintegrates. Branches snap like matchsticks. You don't aim at a sniper. You aim at where the sniper could be and flatten the whole area. This wasn't precision warfare. It was dominance. Pure, terrifying, jungle-clearing dominance. And to the enemy, it was so crushing. Japanese snipers, for all their discipline and training, weren't just fighters, they were masters of concealment. They could sit in a tree for days, unmoving. They had the advantage in jungle terrain for years. Until this. Suddenly, their greatest weapon, stealth, was useless. They weren't just hiding. They were hunted. Because when the Quad 50 rolled up, your hiding spot became a coffin with leaves. That shift in psychological momentum, massive, and it didn't take long for word to spread. Japanese troops began avoiding elevated positions altogether. Tree ambushes, once their bread and butter, dropped off. They started digging in lower, using caves, ground positions, anything to stay out of the trees. Because now, trees could get you killed faster than standing in the open. And that's what made the Quad 50 so much more than a weapon. It became a message. An audible, visible declaration. We can reach you anywhere. There's nowhere left to hide. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting. The quad mount didn't have fancy optics. No smart targeting systems. No thermal sensors. What it had was muscle, and a crew with guts. These weren't snipers behind scopes. These were artillery crews working as makeshift jungle surgeons, carving entire paths through thick forest with volume alone. It's easy to underestimate what that meant. In the Pacific, most firefights were up close and nasty. Visibility was trash. Movement was limited. You couldn't rely on air support every time you got pinned down. But if you had a Quad 50 team nearby, that was your air support, artillery, and shock weapon all rolled into one, ready to flatten whatever stood in your way. But let's not pretend this was easy. Using a weapon like this in the jungle came with huge risks. First, there was ammo. Each gun fired roughly 550 rounds per minute. Times 4. You're burning through over 2,000 rounds every minute. That's an insane logistical burden. You needed constant resupply, or your thunderstorm suddenly became a paperweight. Second, you had heat. These barrels got hot. Sustained fire could melt them down or jam the entire mount. Crews had to work fast, swap barrels, stay alert, and coordinate under pressure. No small task when the enemy was firing back. Third, mobility. The M16 half-track wasn't exactly a jungle crawler. It was loud, heavy, and awkward on narrow terrain. Getting it into position without getting bogged down or ambushed was a challenge in itself. You couldn't just roll through the forest like you were on a country drive. You had to plan, clear paths, and have infantry support you all the way. But the payoff, worth every ounce of effort. The Quad 50 wasn't a perfect machine, it was a solution. An evolving, problem-solving monster that gave troops a fighting chance in one of the most brutal combat environments on Earth. And it didn't stop in the Philippines. Once its effectiveness spread through the ranks, the doctrine caught up. Field commanders started incorporating quad-mount tactics into official operations. Infantry units were trained to call in Quad 50s for support. Jungle clearing became faster. Casualties dropped. Entire engagements swung because someone said, "Bring up the 50." It was battlefield innovation at its rawest. No spreadsheets. No tech briefings. Just soldiers saying, "What if we use that thing this way?" And the rest, as they say, was history. But what really seals the legend of the Quad 50 is its staying power. Fast forward to Korea. Different terrain, different enemy, different war, but guess what's still showing up on the battlefield? That same rugged, jungle-born monster. This time, it's being used against waves of enemy infantry, convoy ambushes, and ridgeline machine gun nests. Same gun, same terror, still devastating. Then came Vietnam and the gun gets a second life again. Now it's mounted on the back of gun trucks, protecting convoys from guerrilla ambushes and road mines. Nicknamed meat choppers, these vehicles turn jungle roads into danger zones for the enemy. And once again, it wasn't because of new tech, it was because of how it was used. How soldiers kept adapting it to new threats. That adaptability. That's where the magic lives. We talk a lot about game changers in military history. The tank, the jet, the nuke. But sometimes, the true game changers aren't the big, flashy inventions. Sometimes, they're the tools that soldiers refuse to let go of. The ones they trust. The ones they make better just by finding new ways to use them. That's what the Quad 50 was. It wasn't revolutionary when it rolled off the assembly line. But it became revolutionary in the hands of soldiers who looked at it and thought, we can do more with this. And that idea, that mindset, it lives on in every soldier who rigs up an old drone to drop grenades, or uses a smartphone to coordinate fire teams, or straps a GoPro to their helmet for recon. The spirit of battlefield innovation didn't start with Silicon Valley, it started with crews firing into treetops because the manual said aircraft only, but the battlefield said, whatever works. So, what's the legacy? It's this: war isn't won by perfect weapons. It's won by imperfect tools used perfectly by people who refuse to let a good idea go to waste. The M45 quad mount didn't just survive across 3 wars. It thrived. Because its users ordinary soldiers, not weapons designers, refused to limit its purpose. They saw potential where others saw a checkbox on a supply list. And in doing so, they turned it into something greater than the sum of its parts. They turned a defensive mount into an offensive powerhouse, a backline support gun into a frontline legend, a weapon of fear for those on the wrong side of its barrels. So next time you hear a tale about high-tech dominance or cutting-edge innovation, remember the Quad 50. Remember the noise it made, the trees it brought down, the fear it spread, and most of all, remember the soldiers who didn't wait for permission to be brilliant. Because sometimes, changing the war doesn't mean building something new. Sometimes, it just means turning the turret sideways. Just turn the turret sideways. That's all it took. That one simple act, pointing a skybound anti-aircraft weapon toward the trees, flipped an entire tactical problem on its head. 1 minute, American troops were getting picked off from above, trapped under a canopy that doubled as enemy territory. The next, they were cutting entire trees in half, watching snipers fall like broken branches. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't subtle. But in war, elegance doesn't win battles. Results do. And the Quad 50 delivered them, again and again and again. But what makes this story so endlessly fascinating isn't just the firepower or the battlefield success. It's the attitude behind it. The fact that nobody was supposed to use this weapon that way, and yet someone did anyway. Because they had to. Because they were under fire, under pressure, and out of options. And in that moment, creativity became survival. That's what turns a weapon into a legend. Not specs, not blueprints, not doctrine. Instinct. Let's put this in perspective. Military history is filled with weapons that were supposed to be revolutionary, only to end up gathering dust in warehouses. Designed by committees, tested in labs, and promptly forgotten because they didn't work on a real battlefield. But the Quad 50, the ugly, boxy, thunder-spitting Frankenstein of a gun, that thing stuck around for decades. Not because of a government memo, but because soldiers kept saying, "Don't retire it yet. We still need it." It's like that one old tool in the garage that somehow always does the job, even when everything new breaks down. The ratchet with the busted grip, the drill with duct tape on the handle. It might not look pretty, but it saved your ass too many times to let it go. That was the Quad 50 to the US military. And let's talk about fear for a second, because fear is one of the most powerful currencies in combat. The moment the enemy fears a weapon, its value doubles. And in jungle warfare, where visibility is zero and every shadow feels like it's watching you, fear becomes a strategic weapon all on its own. The sound of a Quad 50 spooling up became iconic, not just for what it did but for what it meant. It meant we know where you are. It meant we're not trapped anymore. And if you were hiding in a tree, hoping your camouflage would protect you, it meant you're next. Now imagine being the sniper in that tree. You're trained. You've got patience. You've got elevation. You've picked your target, lined up your shot, and then the entire forest below you comes alive with fire. Not one gun, not one direction, but a hailstorm of rounds chewing through the very branches you're sitting on. What do? Climb down, run. There's nowhere to go. No cover left. Just noise and heat and destruction. That's why the Quad 50 wasn't just a battlefield advantage, it was a psychological collapse trigger. It didn't just kill enemies, it broke their plans. It stripped them of their advantage. And when the rules of jungle warfare flipped that dramatically, it wasn't just the Americans who noticed. It was everyone. Reports started circulating. Enemy scouts returning to camp, faces pale, describing a weapon that cut down the forest. Units changing tactics to avoid confrontation altogether. Strategic positions abandoned not because of overwhelming numbers, but because of the sound of one half-track in the distance. And that's influence. That's the kind of legacy most weapons never achieve. Because this wasn't some missile with an aim designed to scare people. It didn't come with $1 billion PR campaign. It just showed up, did its job, and changed everything. The beauty is in the simplicity. For Browning machine guns, mounted on a turret, mounted on a truck, no frills, no finesse, just a storm in a box, ready to be unleashed by a crew of soldiers who knew exactly what they were doing and why they were doing it. And those crews, they don't always get the spotlight, but they were the backbone of this whole operation. Trained to move fast, think faster, and coordinate with infantry under fire. They weren't frontline heroes in the traditional sense, but they were the cavalry. The hammer that dropped when things got desperate. They weren't there to look cool. They were there to level the field. And man, did they deliver.